What if I told you that for some people, sex isn't about love, closeness, or connection at all, but about power, control, and feeding an empty ego? That while you think you're sharing intimacy, they're quietly collecting validation, measuring their worth through your body, your attention, and your desire. And the moment you stop giving it, the charm fades, the mask drops, and behaviors you never imagined start to surface. Guilt, manipulation, jealousy, punishment, even cruelty, not because they're heartbroken, but because their supply has been cut off. And once you see intimacy through this lens, you realize you were never in a relationship built on love. You were standing inside a system designed to extract energy from you while giving almost nothing real in return. When we talk about the first idea, that sexual attention is supply to a narcissist rather than intimacy, we have to completely change the way we think about closeness. Because for most healthy people, sex is about connection, warmth, and emotional safety. It is about feeling seen and chosen by someone you trust. But for a narcissist, it functions more like fuel for their ego, more like applause than affection. And this distinction is exactly what psychologists like Dr. Ramani often try to teach, that what looks romantic on the surface can actually be deeply transactional underneath. Because the narcissist is not asking, "How can we share this moment?" They are silently asking, "What does this say about me?" So when you show desire toward them, when you compliment them, when you want them physically, they interpret it as proof of their superiority. Proof that they are special, powerful, and irresistible. And that validation temporarily quiets the deep insecurity they carry inside, the fear that they are ordinary or unworthy. So sex becomes a tool they use to regulate their self-esteem rather than a way to bond with you. Which is why the experience can feel strangely empty or one-sided, because they are focused on being admired, not on mutual pleasure or emotional closeness. And this is also why they may rush intimacy, pressure you, or treat it like something they are entitled to, since to them it is not a shared act that requires care and consent. It is a resource they believe they deserve access to, like attention, praise, or status. And when you start to see it this way, their behavior makes uncomfortable sense. The charm, the seduction, the exaggerated passion in the beginning is often just a strategy to secure supply quickly, not genuine depth. And once they feel validated, the warmth can disappear just as quickly because they were never investing emotionally in the first place. They were simply collecting proof of their desirability, which leaves partners feeling used, confused, and unseen. Because what they thought was intimacy was actually extraction. What they thought was connection was consumption. And what they thought was love was simply the narcissist feeding their fragile ego through someone else's body and attention rather than building something real and reciprocal together. When a narcissist is denied sexual supply, what often rises to the surface first is a volatile mix of rage, shame, and loss of control. And this reaction can seem wildly disproportionate to the situation, because to a healthy person, a partner saying "not tonight" might be mildly disappointing, but still understandable. While to a narcissist, it lands like an insult, a rejection of their worth, a blow to the image they have carefully constructed about themselves. And this is the psychological shift many experts, including voices like Dr. Ramani describe when they explain narcissistic injury, because what looks like a simple boundary to you feels like humiliation to them. And humiliation is something their fragile ego cannot tolerate. So instead of processing the feeling with maturity or empathy, they experience a surge of shame that quickly converts into anger, since anger feels powerful and shame feels weak. And narcissists will almost always choose the emotion that helps them feel dominant, which is why you might suddenly notice irritability, snapping, coldness, or dramatic mood swings over something that should have been a normal, respectful conversation. Because in their mind, your lack of availability is not about your tiredness, stress, or personal needs. It is about them losing control, and control is everything to them. So when they cannot secure validation through intimacy, They begin scrambling psychologically, sometimes picking fights, sometimes criticizing you, sometimes withdrawing affection. All attempts to restore their sense of superiority and push you back into a position where you feel guilty or responsible. And this is where the dynamic becomes deeply manipulative, because they are not simply hurt. They are trying to make you hurt too, as if punishing you will erase their own discomfort. And underneath all of it is the desperate fear of being unwanted, a fear they will never openly admit. So instead of saying, "I feel insecure," they act out, sulk, slam doors, give the silent treatment, or accuse you of things you never did, transforming their internal shame into external chaos, which leaves you walking on eggshells, second-guessing yourself, and feeling pressured to meet their needs just to keep the peace, turning what should be mutual, respectful intimacy into an emotional minefield where your boundaries trigger their rage and your autonomy threatens their unstable sense of self. The third pattern, manipulation, guilt, and punishment to regain power, is where the narcissist's behavior shifts from wounded to calculated, because once they realize they are not getting the sexual attention or validation they crave, they stop simply reacting and start strategizing. And this is the moment the relationship begins to feel less like a partnership and more like a psychological game, where every word and every emotion is used as leverage, something many clinicians and educators such as Dr. Ramani frequently warn about when discussing coercive dynamics, because the narcissist cannot tolerate feeling powerless. So instead of respecting your boundaries, they attempt to bend reality until you doubt yourself. They might sigh heavily, act wounded, or say things like, "I guess you're just not attracted to me anymore," or "anyone else would want me." Statements designed not to communicate feelings, but to plant guilt. And guilt is one of their favorite tools, because a guilty partner is easier to control, easier to pressure, easier to push into compliance. So you start explaining yourself for perfectly normal needs, apologizing for being tired, stressed, or simply not in the mood, and slowly you find yourself negotiating over your own body as if it were something you owe them, which is exactly the psychological trap they want. Because once you feel responsible for their emotions, they regain the upper hand. And if guilt doesn't work, they often escalate to punishment, becoming cold, distant, sarcastic, or withholding affection, creating an atmosphere of tension where love feels conditional, as though warmth is something you must earn by meeting their demands. And this silent treatment or emotional withdrawal is not accidental. It is meant to make you anxious and desperate to restore harmony, so you may give in just to end the discomfort, not because you truly want intimacy. And that is the core of manipulation, transforming your free choice into reluctant compliance, turning connection into obligation. And over time, this erodes your confidence and autonomy, because you start prioritizing their moods over your own comfort, living in a constant state of hyper-awareness, trying to prevent the next punishment, while they sit back feeling powerful again, having successfully replaced mutual respect with control and genuine desire with fear-based submission. The fourth behavior, devaluing you, cheating, or triangulating with others to provoke jealousy, is one of the most psychologically cruel tactics a narcissist uses when they feel their sexual or emotional supply slipping away. Because instead of addressing their insecurity directly, they attempt to manufacture competition, as if turning love into a contest will restore their sense of power. And this is where the relationship begins to feel destabilizing and deeply unsafe, since you are no longer dealing with honest communication, but with deliberate mind games. Something many clinicians, including Dr. Ramani, often describe as triangulation, where a third person is introduced, either real or implied, to create anxiety and comparison. And suddenly, the narcissist starts mentioning how an ex used to desire them more, or how someone at work keeps flirting with them, or how strangers constantly compliment their looks, comments that may sound casual on the surface, but are carefully designed to make you feel replaceable, because if you feel insecure, You are more likely to chase their approval, and chasing restores their control, so they might openly flirt in front of you, like photos online for attention, text other people late at night, or even cheat outright, not necessarily because they feel deep passion for someone else, but because they crave the ego boost of being wanted by multiple people. And each new admirer becomes proof that they are still desirable, still superior, still powerful, while you are left feeling confused, hurt, and questioning your worth. And the devaluation often intensifies alongside this, with subtle or direct criticisms about your appearance, your body, or your personality, as though tearing you down will make their other options look more appealing, creating a painful emotional whiplash where one day you are idealized and the next you are treated as inadequate. And this constant comparison keeps you off balance, trying harder, overgiving, and competing for basic affection, which is exactly the trap, because instead of mutual respect and security, the narcissist builds a dynamic fueled by jealousy, rivalry, and fear of abandonment, turning intimacy into a marketplace where people are swapped and displayed like trophies, and your emotional safety becomes collateral damage in their endless search for validation. The fifth behavior, objectifying partners and treating bodies like validation tools, is perhaps the most dehumanizing pattern of all, because it strips intimacy of its emotional meaning and reduces a living, feeling person into a mirror meant to reflect the narcissist's worth. And this is where the relationship can start to feel hollow and strangely mechanical, as though you are present physically but invisible emotionally, a dynamic frequently described by clinicians and educators such as Dr. Ramani, who explain that narcissists often relate to people not as individuals with needs and feelings, but as objects that serve a function. And in the context of sexuality, that function is validation, admiration, and proof of desirability. So instead of asking what you feel, what you enjoy, or what makes you comfortable, their focus stays fixed on how your attention makes them look and feel, how being desired boosts their ego, how having access to your body confirms their power, and this creates an unsettling experience where intimacy feels one-sided, rushed, or performative, because they are not truly connecting, they are consuming, collecting reassurance with every touch, while offering very little emotional presence in return. And you may notice that your boundaries, preferences, or comfort levels are minimized or ignored, as if your inner world is irrelevant compared to their need for affirmation, which can leave you feeling used rather than cherished, like a prop in their self-esteem drama, rather than a partner in a shared moment. And when the validation fades or becomes routine, their interest often fades too, because without that ego boost, the interaction loses value to them, revealing that what you thought was passion was actually self-centered hunger. And this is why they might suddenly grow distant, bored, or critical, seeking new sources of attention elsewhere, since to them people are interchangeable sources of supply rather than unique bonds to protect. And over time, this objectification quietly erodes your sense of worth, because being treated like a tool instead of a human being teaches you to disconnect from your own needs just to keep their approval, transforming what should be mutual, respectful intimacy into a transaction where your body becomes currency and your emotional reality slowly disappears behind their endless craving to feel desired. The sixth idea, the difference between healthy intimacy and narcissistic sexuality, is where everything becomes painfully clear. Because once you understand this contrast, you can finally see why being with a narcissist feels so confusing and emotionally draining, since what should feel warm and mutual instead feels tense and one-sided. And this distinction is often emphasized by clinicians and educators such as Dr. Ramani, who explain that true intimacy is rooted in empathy, respect, and emotional safety, not performance or validation. So in a healthy connection, both people show up as equals, both care about each other's comfort, both listen, and both value consent, not just as a rule, but as an expression of care, which means sex becomes an extension of trust and affection, something shared freely rather than extracted, and there is no pressure, no bargaining, no fear of punishment if one person is tired or not in the mood, because the bond itself feels secure enough to handle temporary distance, while narcissistic sexuality operates on a completely different emotional system. One driven by insecurity and ego maintenance rather than love, where the other person is unconsciously treated as a resource whose job is to provide admiration, attention, and proof of desirability. So the focus shifts away from connection and toward consumption. And instead of asking, how can we feel close? The narcissist is internally asking, am I being wanted enough? Which turns every intimate moment into a test of their worth. And when you become a tool for someone else's self-esteem, the energy changes immediately, the tenderness disappears, replaced by pressure or expectation, and you might feel as though you are performing a role rather than sharing yourself authentically, because the interaction revolves around keeping them satisfied rather than expressing mutual desire. And over time, this imbalance quietly erodes your sense of safety, since love should expand you. But this dynamic makes you shrink, constantly monitoring their moods and adjusting yourself to avoid conflict, revealing that what they call passion is often just dependency disguised as romance, a pattern where they take emotional and physical energy from you without truly giving presence, empathy, or genuine care in return. In the end, everything we have talked about comes back to one uncomfortable but liberating truth, that what a narcissist calls passion is often nothing more than hunger. What they call chemistry is often control, and what they call intimacy is often extraction. Because when sex is treated as supply rather than connection, the entire foundation of a relationship becomes distorted. And instead of two people choosing each other freely, you get one person taking and the other slowly giving themselves away, piece by piece, until they feel exhausted, confused, and invisible. And this is the pattern so many survivors describe, and that educators like Dr. Ramani consistently warn about, where the charm at the beginning hides a system of entitlement, guilt, manipulation, jealousy, objectification, and emotional punishment that only appears when the narcissist is no longer being fed constant validation. Because the moment you set a boundary or simply act like a human being with your own needs, the mask slips and the behaviors turn cold, coercive, and sometimes cruel, revealing that their interest was never about knowing you deeply, but about using you to feel powerful, and recognizing this is not meant to make you cynical about love. It is meant to sharpen your awareness, to help you separate real intimacy from psychological dependency, because healthy love feels calm, respectful, and mutual. It does not make you anxious or obligated. It does not punish you for saying no, and it does not treat your body like currency. And once you truly understand that sex is energy, emotional and psychological energy as much as physical, you begin to guard it more carefully. You stop negotiating your boundaries to keep someone comfortable, you stop chasing approval from people who only take, and you start choosing connections where desire flows both ways, where consent is honored, and where closeness is built on trust rather than fear, because your energy, your body, and your emotional presence are not supplies for someone else's fragile ego. They are expressions of your humanity, and they deserve to be shared only with those who see you not as a source of validation, but as a whole, worthy, and equal human being.